Hello everybody and welcome to Bite Size Biology, and today we are looking at the nervous system. The nervous system is a tricky enough chapter at the start for sure, because there's a lot of diagrams to know, and they're not easy diagrams either. There are a lot of learning and a bit of understanding there as well. So a tricky enough chapter, but it does come up fairly often, and the questions are fairly repetitive. So we'll look at the main questions here. The first one I said was about the diagrams. So you could be asked to draw the motor and sensory and interneurons. Could be asked to draw the reflex arc. Reflex arc, I don't think that's been asked in a while now in terms of drawing it. A lot of the times though, they actually give you the diagram of it and they ask you to label it. Part 2. Describe the events of the nerve impulse. So how it converts from electrical impulse to a chemical impulse and back to electrical impulse. You could be asked to distinguish between the CNS, the PNS, grey and white matter, the nervous system and the hormonal system, the endocrine system. That comes up quite often. Part 4. Label and state the functions of the different parts of the brain. So the brain is also inside this chapter. It's kind of like a separate section within the chapter. So you could be asked to give a picture of the brain and asked to label the parts and state the functions. That wouldn't be uncommon now. Definitions as normal, linked to homeostasis. There is a bit of a link there too. What else is there? There's one more actually I didn't mention, and that's on a disorder that you need to know, and that's Parkinson's. So starting off with 2020, and as I've said in previous videos, that I don't have the marking scheme just yet. 2020 it has not been published. I obviously will give you the correct answers here. There may be other correct answers, I'm not sure. So you're given a sensory neuron, you're told this, and you're asked to identify the part of it that's labeled B, which is here. So B is like the center of it here, the middle part, okay, going down, and that's the axon. That's where the electrical impulse travels through. Name the substance released by A during a nerve impulse. So A is neurotransmitter swellings, and these neurotransmitter swellings release neurotransmitters. Remember, neurotransmitters are released by neurotransmitter swellings, but they are produced in the cell body, which is up here. Name a substance produced by the Schwann cell. You learned this off, and that's myelin. And next question usually is, what's the function of it, which it is here, and that is to insulate and speed up the impulse. E is a common enough question too. They ask you to show the direction of the impulse. Like everybody, it doesn't matter whether it's a sensory neuron or a motor neuron. That impulse is always traveling towards the neurotransmitter swellings. Okay, so obviously my arrow here. And the final part then is about Parkinson's, and you're asked to state a cause of it. So a lack of dopamine is the cause for us here. It's the one that I just tell my students and they just learn it off. Treatment, physiotherapy. I have seen students in the past use medicine or write down medicine there or drugs, and they get no marks. Unless you specifically reference dopamine, so if you said drugs that mimic dopamine or something along those lines, you'll get the marks. But if you just say medicine or medicine or drugs on their own, it's too vague. You're not going to get the marks in 2020 onwards. 2019 is about the brain, and you can see you're given a diagram here of the brain, a list of labels there, and you have to label A to F, and you're probably going to be asked to state the functions of them. So without further ado, we'll get started. So A over here is your the cerebellum, which is this part here. So A is your cerebellum. B over here is the biggest part of it, so that's your cerebrum. C is looks like a drop here. Okay, so that's your pituitary gland, also known as the master gland. It releases a lot of hormones. So that's C. Where is D? D is over here. So if we're looking up here, D is the hypothalamus. No, I get confused there now. Sorry, D, everybody, is the medulla oblongata, I should say. And that's responsible for your involuntary actions. Okay. So D is the medulla oblongata, and the hypothalamus is actually F. Just to clarify that one there, just above the pituitary gland. Hypothalamus is responsible for homeostasis. Think of H for hypothalamus, H for homeostasis. Now I skipped one. Now it's E. E, everybody, is a spinal cord, which obviously is connected to the rest of the nervous system. Give a function to medulla oblongata, give a function to cerebellum. So cerebellum there, everybody, was A, and the medulla oblongata was D. So I don't think I said what the cerebellum was. So cerebellum controls all the voluntary actions. So when you actually think about making a movement or catching something or whatever, okay, that's the cerebellum that's responsible for that. The medulla oblongata, as I said, controls the involuntary actions. So we have those two answered there. Next, you are asked why is grey matter so called and why is white matter so called. Like, there's no point being smart here and saying that grey matter is grey matter because it's grey and white matter because it's white. That's how you identify it in labelling the reflex arc and stuff like that. But you do need to know why they're called that. Okay, so learn this off. Grey matter consists of cell bodies. White matter consists of myelin and axons. You learn that off. Okay, it comes up too often not to just learn it off. So grey matter, cell bodies; white matter, myelin, axons. That's it. Okay. I actually wouldn't even go down the route of trying to understand that, because it's actually quite complicated and you can get very, very detailed. Just learn it off. Okay, so grey matter, cell bodies; white matter, myelin, and your axons. IV. Endocrine glands produce hormones. What is meant by the term endocrine? So endocrine means ductless, which we have over here. So it secretes its product, which are hormones, directly into the bloodstream. V. The pituitary gland is an example of an endocrine gland. Name a hormone secreted by the pituitary gland. Now there's loads you could say here. And give a function of this hormone in the human body. Again, there's quite a lot you could say here. I always go with ADH myself. And ADH is responsible for making the collecting duct and the DCT inside the nephron more permeable, so more water is reabsorbed, which I have here. But like I said, I'm not going to actually go through any of the rest of them because there's actually so many there. The pituitary gland is known as the master gland, so there's and the reason because it secretes so many different products. BI. Name one gland in the human body that is both endocrine and exocrine functions. That has. Now all you said is to name it. You didn't need to say the functions. There's actually quite a few for this. So you could say the kidneys, you could say the pancreas. Okay, it's a dual function. But the testes and ovaries and liver as well. Testes and ovaries you should know from reproductive systems. The kidney by means of excretion, and also the endocrine system, and the pancreas, the digestive system, and the endocrine system. Okay, 2018. Lovely question. I really did like it. It hasn't been asked in a while. Outline the role of each of the following in the transmission of a nerve impulse: dendrites, axon, cell body. So you're to state their functions. I'll leave you read that there for a second. The dendrites receive the impulse, the axon carries the impulse away from the cell body, that's always the case, and the cell body receives the impulses, it produces neurotransmitters. Produces, does not secrete, but produces. Now, this is the heart of the question here, really. Describe how a nerve impulse is transmitted across a synaptic cleft from one neuron to the next. You need to have this almost word perfect, really. Okay, there's no points that you should be skipping out here. So starting off, an electrical impulse arrives at a neurotransmitter swelling, and this causes a neurotransmitter to be secreted. The neurotransmitter diffuses across the synaptic cleft. The dendrites at the other end of the cleft converts the chemical into electrical impulse. And finally then, you'd say then that the enzymes break down the neurotransmitter. So the neurotransmitter is like a boat. Okay, it simply brings the impulse from one side to the other side, and once it's carried out its job, it's recycled. So the enzymes break down to neurotransmitter. So there's 4 points there. I would state all 4 of them, to be honest. You might get the marks for just 3 of them, but in other marking schemes you don't. I'm pretty sure this one you needed all of them. Explain the importance of the myelin sheath in the transmission of a nerve impulse. So it insulates, and it more correctly though, it speeds up the nerve impulse. And the reason I say it more correctly because it's asking about the transmission of a nerve impulse specifically. So I would always say myelin helps speed up the nerve impulse. Okay, 2015's got to do with our reflex arc and our spinal cord and so forth. So name the parts A, B and C. So A is your grey matter, obviously because it's grey. B is your white matter because, it's white. And C is called the central canal or the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, either or you can say for that. But central canal is kind of the more standard one. What is the main structural difference between A and B? So what's the difference between grey and white matter? As I said before, guys, you just need to learn this off. Grey matter, cell bodies. White matter, myelin, axons. What is the function of the meninges and how many layers are present in the meninges? So the function is protection. It's a shock absorber. So your meninges there are a shock absorber and they go around all of this. Okay? So shock absorber, and you have 3 of them in total. There's like 3 different membranes. Reflex actions are really important for animals. What is a reflex action, and outline the mechanism of a reflex action. So there's 2, I suppose, descriptive mechanisms here. One of them is the transmission of a nerve impulse across the synaptic cleft, and the second one is the reflex action. So first off, what is a reflex action? It is an involuntary response to a stimulus. I see a lot of students and they always write down an automatic or an involuntary response. Either or, doesn't matter whether they say automatic or involuntary. But they never say why. You must refer to a stimulus. A stimulus is what causes that reaction. Okay, so an involuntary response to a stimulus. And you're asked to outline the mechanism of it. So receptors are stimulated. The sensory neuron carries impulse to the spinal cord via the interneuron to the motor neuron to the effector muscle. A separate impulse goes to the brain simultaneously. Now, I will go into that into a bit more detail when I show you the diagram of it next time. But the receptors, so that's your, if you touch something hot, okay, the receptors, I always think of a reception. It receives the impulse, I suppose, or receives the, maybe not the impulse, but the feeling, okay? The sensory neuron, because it senses it, carries it towards the spinal cord, through the interneuron, which connects the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, and then back to the effector muscle. And the effector, think of effect, what's going to happen then. So if you touch something hot, you automatically move your hand away from it. Okay, so that's your effector muscle. A separate impulse goes towards the brain at the same time. Okay, we'll discuss that in more detail though later on. I promise, it's actually towards the end. We're almost there. Just over halfway actually. Name the type of particle whose movement in outer neurons is an essential feature of a nerve impulse transmission. Ions. Potassium ions to be precise, but there's more to it than that. I wouldn't go into huge amount of detail here, guys. It's too complicated. One of the roles of the particles referred to is the activation of neurotransmitters. Give an account of how neurotransmitters work. This is exactly what we've said before. How do the neurotransmitters form? How are they produced? How do they get across the synaptic cleft? And what happens then? So the electrical impulse arrives at the neurotransmitter swellings. It causes the neurotransmitters to secrete a neurotransmitter. Okay? Neurotransmitter swellings to secrete a neurotransmitter, which diffuses across the synaptic cleft. The dendrite then, on the other end, converts the chemical into an electrical impulse. And then finally, you have your enzyme then breaking down the neurotransmitter. And so it can be recycled. Distinguish between the position of the cerebellum and the position of the cerebrum in the human brain. So the cerebellum is the hind brain and the cerebrum is the forebrain. And that's just something you have to learn off. And then you're asked for the functions of the cerebrum. So the cerebrum there is the forebrain, it's right at the front. So that's quite a lot of functions. But memory, learning, and emotions are the three that I picked. Languages and stuff like that, like all of that comes into the cerebrum. Okay, 2012. Distinguish between the CNS, the central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. Include a clear reference to each in your answer, and give one way in which a nervous response differs from a hormonal response. Okay, so the CNS is the brain and the spinal cord, and the PNS is the nerves leading to and from the CNS. You learn it off. So you're asked the difference between a hormonal response and a nervous response. There's quite a few differences. I suppose a nervous response automatically is electrical. Hormonal is chemical. The electrical responses are very fast acting. Hormonal is very slow acting. You could argue that the nervous response is localized, whereas a hormonal response is widespread. Hormonal response is long-lasting, whereas nervous response is short-lasting. So quite a few there, you could say. B, draw a label diagram of a motor neuron. So this is what we have here. Your motor neuron here. So remember I was saying about the motor neuron has the cell body at the very end with the dendrites. The direction of the impulse always goes towards the neurotransmitter swellings. That doesn't change. It's almost identical, guys, to that of the sensory neuron, except for the sensory neuron, you have the cell body in the middle there somewhere. The questions now will be very similar. Give one function each of any two parts found only in neurons. Well, there's loads you could have said there. I just said axons and swan cells. So axons carry impulses away from the cell body, and a swan cell carries impulses, makes the myelin sheath, I should say. Makes myelin. An arrow, you've seen that already. Name and state any two types of neuron other than the motor neuron. So you've got the sensory neuron and you've got the interneuron. So the sensory neuron carries impulses to the CNS, and the interneuron carries impulses between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. It goes sensory neuron first, interneuron, motor neuron. That's in your spinal cord there where your reflex arc is. Okay, B, you're asked to draw, we've done B already, C, and you can see here it's going to be the same functions that you've been asked before. So have a look at them and just think off the top of your head, can you name the functions for each of those following parts? Okay, so your cerebrum is your memory, language and so forth. Hypothalamus is homeostasis. The cerebellum is your hind. I'm actually can't think of it there now for a second there. Is your hind brain, and the medulla oblongata is your involuntary actions. And we need to go back to the cerebellum there. Movement, yeah. I was trying to think of it there, I couldn't think of it. So your movement, your even stuff like just coordination and so forth, the cerebellum is for that. Okay. Okay. In relation to nervous system, distinguish between grey and white matter. Okay, we've done that before. Okay, and Parkinson's there again. So you can see questions are starting to become very repetitive now, guys. Grey matter, cell bodies. White matter, myelin, axons. Parkinson's, lack of dopamine is the cause. Physiotherapy is the treatment. Okay, I think we're on towards the last questions here now. Parkinson's, we've done that, okay. I kind of wanted to focus in here on the reflex action, as I said we would do again. So what is a reflex action? As I said, it is either an automatic or an involuntary response to a stimulus. But please, can we say a response to a stimulus in your answers? Otherwise you may not get the marks. give an example of it. Coughing, sneezing is an example of reflex action. We've seen those two already. But part 3 you haven't. An advantage of it is for protection. Okay, so like, why do we have reflex actions? Protection. Now, IV is also new, and you're asked to draw a reflex arc. I told you it has been a while now since the diagram of you being expected to draw the reflex arc has come up. So draw a large table diagram of structure involved in the reflex arc. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do here. So we have I just took it from earlier. You have your grey matter, you have your white matter. This is your central canal. I didn't put that in for some reason. You've got your receptor. Remember what I said? Receptor is what receives the sense. Okay, the sensory neuron carries that impulse. Okay, the interneuron here transmits it between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. The motor neuron carries the impulse to the effector muscle, telling it what to do. The effector muscle responds. So you touch something hot, you sense it's hot. The sensory neuron brings it towards the interneuron, brings it towards the motor neuron, and the effector muscle moves your hand straight away. In the meantime, simultaneously to this, another impulse is going towards your spinal cord, towards the brain, so that the brain can also think about it too. Okay, the reflex action or reflex arc, as it's known here, is involuntary. It just happens, and like I said, it's for protection. An extra second or two away from touching something that is incredibly dangerous to us is obviously trying to preserve the body and so forth, trying to save us. Place arrows in your diagram show the direction of the impulse. So you can see here, the receptor receives it. It goes towards the sensory neuron. And I knew this was a sensory neuron, everybody, because you have the cell body here, and it's in the middle of your axons. Your interneuron here, and then your motor neuron here. That was it. And I think we're finished now. We are. So that was a tough enough one. 2010. It's been a while since that's come up. To draw all of that, I'd definitely practice this if I were you guys. The direction of the arrows, I can see that being asked again for sure. Okay, hasn't been asked in a while. So we go back right up to the top here. We're going to finish up now. So you can see here the diagrams come up quite often, whether you're asked to draw them or whether you're given the diagram of them and you're asked to label them. Defense of the nerve impulse, okay, you've seen that come up, and again, you do need to be hitting those 4 points each time. Distinguishing between all these different types here, they've come up quite often, and I didn't put in 1 or 2 questions simply because it's just repeating all of these questions again. 4, the brain, you can see there, comes up fairly frequently. You do need to know the functions, definitions, and linked to homeostasis, the hypothalamus and so forth. Not really is such a big thing, but it is there. And don't forget Parkinson's as well. So that's it, guys. Look, I hope you took something from that, and all the best with your study in biology.